So last week we looked at verbal reasoning, which was the first chunk of UCAT that you have to be able to do, and we saw that the issue wasn't that the questions were terribly difficult; it was that you have to do them incredibly quickly. And so the big takeaway from last time, which hopefully you've remembered, is that what you can usefully be doing at this point is just trying to increase your reading speed. So just practicing reading things quickly, extracting information fast, because that will really make it easier once you come to doing the actual focus preparation on the UCAT in the summer. So we'll move on now to the next section, which is called decision making. And this is quite different. So in this, they give you a series of sort of logic puzzles of various different kinds. There are basically 6 different kinds of puzzle that you have to get used to. And again, it's just multiple choice answers, and you have to go through them as quickly as you can. And the difference this time is going to be that some of them to start with may seem a bit more difficult because the format's not so familiar as verbal reasoning. But actually, in the end, this section tends, on average, to get the highest marks in UCAT. So it's important not to be put off at the beginning by the fact that you think, oh, I'm not used to doing questions like this. This is going to be really hard. Because when you've just practiced a few of them, they're actually really not. And you still have to go very fast, but it's not quite as insanely fast as in the verbal reasoning section. So that's what we'll start looking at. And because they're new types of question, it'll take a bit longer to go through it. So we'll probably do half of it this week and half of it next week or next time. So these are the 6 different types of questions. And you can see at the bottom that, again, it looks quite fast. You have to do roughly 1 question a minute to keep up to speed with this. But in reality, that's going to be some questions that you'll be able to do in much less than a minute to give you time for some more challenging ones, which might take considerably more than a minute. So that's very much an average rather than a target for each individual question. So first type of question they call logical puzzles. And the idea is that they're going to give you usually a small amount of text. It's not a great long passage like you have in verbal reasoning, just a small amount of textual information, or sometimes a diagram or a table or something. And then underneath it, they give you 4 statements. And one of them will definitely be true based on the information you've been given. And it's important you only take account of the information you've given. If you have extra knowledge, you have to ignore that. If it's an opinion thing, you have to disagree, and you happen to disagree with it, you have to ignore that, and you have to go with what the information is that you're given. And there should be one statement which is definitely true based on that information. The other ones will either just be plain wrong, or there just won't be enough information for you to say either way. And because only one is going to be the answer, then as with verbal reasoning, you just go through until you find the right one, and then you can stop and move on to the next question. Okay, so let's have a look at the first example of that. So say in reality, you'd have about a minute to do this. So I'll tell you when the minute's up, but we'll actually give you more time since this is the first one you've looked at. Okay, so see what you make of that. You might well think that scribbling some stuff down on paper would be sensible for questions like this. In the real exam, you have a whiteboard, so you can do the scribbling down. So see what you think, but I would certainly not attempt to do this without scribbling down stuff on something as I work through it. Okay, so how many people have got an answer? So if you're finding it quite difficult, that's because you're not writing stuff down. Questions like this, it's just much easier if you scribble down. So in this case, basically what you want to do is construct a family tree, and you can just do that in rough very quickly, and then the answer becomes very obvious. So don't try and do everything in your head. It's just not worth it. And as I say, you get a whiteboard in the real thing, so there's no problem about jotting down whatever you need to. And I think that's the key. So you might want to get out the paper and pen, just because in the subsequent ones, again, some of them you don't need it, but quite often you really do. Okay, so any offers? Which one do we think is right? So C, how many people agree with that one? Yeah, C was the right answer for that one. So, and this is more or less the way that I did, I just started scribbling down a tree. So it tells you that Lisa and Dan are partners and they have a daughter, Nancy, so you can put that down. And then it tells you that Nancy has a son and a daughter, so you can put them down. So, you know, just scribbling that down quickly gives you some structure. And then it tells you that Lisa and Dan also have 4 grandchildren, so there must be another branch to it as well. So you can begin to construct that one. And it tells you that Jim and Chris are Jake's sons, so Jake must be there in the middle somewhere, but crucially, he's not Dan and Lisa's son. So who that leaves are those 2 question marks there, which is Nancy's partner and Jake's partner. But the important thing is that Nancy's a daughter, and the unknown partner of Jake is also a daughter, and therefore Lisa and Dan have 2 daughters, was the right answer for that one. So I think you hopefully got the message that just sitting there thinking about it, it's quite difficult to sort things like that out because there's just too much information to keep in your head. So the thing to do is not waste any time at the beginning. Just go straight in, start scribbling the stuff down, so that the information is down there and there's no risk of you forgetting it or muddling it up. Because once it's there in front of you, it's quite easy to work out which of those things is true and which are not. And as always, you know, if you've spotted that one, you don't then really need to check the rest, so long as you're confident that what you've got is right. And that's going to make it quicker. But that was quite challenging to do in a minute. Obviously, we didn't do it against the clock, but you can see that that would have been probably one of the questions that might have taken slightly longer than a minute, and that would be compensated by one of the quicker ones. Okay, so let's do another one of those, and this time I will just give you just over a minute to do it in. So off you go. Okay, so time's up. How many people have got the answer? Okay, so I'll give you a bit longer, but again, you get the point that you've got to practice and practice to get quick at doing these things. Okay, so let's see what we think. How many people think A, B, C, Yeah, C is the right answer for that one. So let's just quickly go through it again. There are only 4 possible arrangements actually that fit the data, but writing them all down is again too time consuming. So I just scribbled one possibility down. So saying, right, well, okay, Meg is the person we're first given information about, and there's no reason to think she couldn't be in any of the corners, but let's put her in corner 1 to start with, and then just put on the rest. So we have Adam diagonally opposite, and then from the remaining positions, it tells us that Meg's room is closer to Tessa's than Polly's, so we can put all those 4 in position like that. And you just have to remember that that's not the only possible arrangement, because we got that by fixing Meg in one corner, but you can see that it means that once you fix Meg's position, there is only one possibility for how the others are arranged. And then you just go through and you say, right, well, which of these could be true? Meg's room number is the lowest. Well, it is in this case, but we could, for example, have swapped Meg and Adam over and put Meg in the bottom right-hand corner and Adam at the top, move people around, and then obviously Meg wouldn't have the lowest number anymore, so that clearly isn't true. Adam's room number is higher than Polly's. Well, it is in this one, but again, if we swap them over and put Meg in the bottom right and Adam top left, then Adam would be in room number 1. So obviously then his room number couldn't be higher than anybody's, so that would be clearly wrong. And then Tessa stays in the room closest to Meg's room, and you can see that must be true because we know that Adam's diagonally opposite Meg, and that just leaves Tessa and Polly, and Tessa's closer than Polly, so she's always going to be along that short side from Meg, and that's as close as you can get. So C is the right answer. And at that point, just like we did with the verbal reasoning, you don't even look at the other one. You say, right, that's right. So you trust yourself and you move on. So that was a little bit easier than the first one, I think. But again, scribbling stuff down to help you focus on what you're doing is really kind of important in those puzzles, I think. Okay, so the second kind of question they call syllogisms. And what happens here is that they give you 2 or more statements that they call premises. In other words, these are things that you have to accept are true. So it doesn't matter if you disagree with them, and it doesn't matter if you have any extra knowledge. You just have to base all your answers on these specific bits of information that you're going to be given, and that you're going to unquestionably accept. And then they give you 5 statements. And for each one this time, you've got to go through and say, does it follow directly from those premises? In other words, is it definitely true given what the premises say? And some of them will be clearly wrong, but quite a lot of them, you just won't have enough information. They could be true, but they might not be. So you say yes if it definitely follows, and no if it's not clear or if it's definitely wrong. Okay, so let's have a look at the first example of that. Okay, so you would have to get all 5 of those done in around a minute. And in terms of the marking, obviously they're marked separately, so it's not that you have to get all 5 of them right to get a score. You get a score for each one you get right, but the timing is quite challenging because you've got to get through all 5 of those in around a minute. So let's just go through them one by one. So first of all, no girl studies only French. What do we think about that one? Yeah, that must be true because it says that all students must study at least 2. So girl or boy, it wouldn't be possible for them to study only French. So that's yes, that's true. All the boys study 2 foreign languages. Yep, that's also true because they have to study at least 2, and it says no boy studies all 3. So that one is definitely a yes. More girls than boys study foreign languages. There's no information about that, is there? It doesn't, nothing to tell you what the relative number of boys and girls are, let alone, well, yeah, that's the problem. So that's a no. More girls than boys study 3 foreign languages. Yeah, that's the one that causes trouble, and that's an interesting one. So the actual answer is no. But the statement that causes the problem is it says no boy studies all 3 foreign languages. And if someone said that to you, if this was just about, you know, having a conversation, you'd think that they were implying that some girls do. But implied doesn't work in this. If it doesn't say it explicitly, then you can't assume that it's true. So it's just, you know, a shortage of information. It tells us that no boy studies all 3 foreign languages, and it doesn't tell us whether or not any girls study 3. So you just can't tell. But that's always the one that catches people out because it's the difference between doing this and the sort of, you know, registering what people are implying when they would just talk to you. But here, everything has to be explicit, otherwise you can't assume that it's true. So no information about how many girls study 3 foreign languages, therefore you can't tell. And at least one boy and at least one girl study the same pair of foreign languages. Sorry, no, you can't tell again from that one because you know, it could be that all the boys study French and German and all the girls study German and Spanish. I mean, there's nothing, you know, you might think, well, that's not very likely, but it could happen. So that's again a no. Okay, so you know, it's not fantastically complicated, but you have got to go through it quite quickly, and you have to remember that the rules are different than they would be if you were just having a conversation with someone, because you can't read things into what they say. It's got to all be explicit, otherwise you say, well, you can't tell. Okay, so let's do another one. I'll get you to do this one in a minute, and I think this one is a little bit easier, so see what you think. Okay, so time's up. So let's just go through those. So if rice is edible, it must have been boiled. What do we think? Yeah, because that's what the first premise says. If rice has been boiled, it must be edible. No, because we haven't, for example, thought about the salt, so that's definite no. Edible rice must have been boiled and salted. Yeah, because that summarizes the 2 premises. If rice has been salted, it must be edible. No, because it may not have been boiled. I mean, they go on a bit, these questions, but you know, in a way, it's a relief because this is just so much easier because you can just rattle through it. And the last one, most ludicrous of all, if rice has been boiled, it must have been salted, obviously. No, but remember, you may be sitting there thinking, well, I could boil rice without salting it, but that's not the point. It's got to be from the premises, but still, it's clearly nonsense. So the important thing to know, all these questions that we're looking at this afternoon, these weren't questions I made up. These are from UCAT's own website. So they produce quite a lot of preparation materials that you can use nearer the time. And so these are all their, you know, the kind of questions that they will set because you know, they're the same people that set the exams. And you can see, therefore, they do vary a lot in difficulty. So when I say 1 minute per question, that doesn't really mean that. It means that's what the average will be, but some you can do much more quickly, and that will give you time to do the longer ones. Yeah. No, I think each individual part is so yeah, they're not weighted according to how difficult they are or anything like that. But basically, you don't have time to worry about that. You just have to plow through and do everything as quickly as you can. Because they come in a sort of random order in the text. It's not like you'll have a group of these and then a group of those and then a group of those. So yeah. Right. So syllogisms with a bit of practice are usually not that difficult. So the third section, they just call interpreting information. And here, some of them are quite similar because, again, they just give you some information in text form, but quite often it's a graph or a table or something. And again, they give you 5 statements, and for each one, you have to go through and say, is it definitely true based on the information you're given or not? So is it false or is it unclear? Again, let's look at the first one. Okay, so let's go through one by one. So history influences geography. What do we think? No. So the whoops, why is it jumping ahead? It seems to have gone nuts, giving all the answers away. Why is it doing that? Okay, well, okay, it's given you all the answers there. So, but just the first one, it's all about the fact that geography influences history, so it's talking about, you know, what difference it makes when you have coastline or rivers or whatever in terms of what the people do. So geography definitely influences history, but there's nothing that here to tell you that history influences geography. Obviously, it does, in the sense that, you know, for example, where people live is influenced by history as well as by the landscape and stuff, but it doesn't tell you that in the text, and therefore that's a no. So geographical patterns directly impact human life. Well, the rivers example is a clear case where that's borne out. So it tells you that civilizations sprang up along rivers. So that is an example of geographical patterns impacting human life. So that's a definite yes. Rivers provide a natural defense against enemies and invaders. So you might think, yeah, that's true. It is sometimes true, but it doesn't say that in the text. There's nothing in the text that to suggest that that's one of the significant impacts that rivers have. So that's a no. And then, yeah, so the fourth one, if we hadn't given the answer away, is a more interesting one to talk about. So average income levels in landlocked regions are possibly lower than those with coastal access. So the key sentence is that it says that accessibility of a region, especially by sea, so obviously that's where landlocked comes in, because it means you don't have any access to the sea, that this triggers economic and social development. So you might reasonably think, well, if you get economic and social development, that might mean that average income levels increase. So that sounds reasonable. But you might also worry and say, yeah, but I mean, suppose, you know, you get this fantastically successful economy, but the king keeps all the money for himself. Does that necessarily mean that average incomes would increase? So you might worry about that, but just reading the statement again, what's the key word that means you don't have to worry about that? Yeah, that word possibly is all important there. Because if it had just said average income levels are lower than those in areas with coastal access, that would have been a bit difficult, because it isn't absolutely necessarily true that economic development means that average incomes would increase. But because it says possibly, then you can say, yeah, okay, that's what I would expect to happen. So that's a yes. So you've got to be really careful with those words that introduce vagueness, like possibly or might be or could be or might be expected to, this kind of stuff, because they allow for the possibility that there could be alternative scenarios, but so long as that seems like a reasonable one, that then you can accept it. So again, that's where the practice comes in, because, you know, once you get a few of those wrong, you begin to think, okay, I've got to really focus on those sort of words, make sure I don't fall foul of those ones. So looking at the last one then, financial success of some countries may be attributable to their vast iron ore and gold deposits. What do you think for that one? Yeah, that's a yes. Because what's the line that tells you that? Yeah, resource-rich regions. So again, you might think, yeah, but we don't know that the resources they're talking about are iron ore and gold, but that doesn't matter, because they could be iron ore and gold, and therefore, because it says may be attributed, not are definitely attributed, then that's fine. Okay, so iron ore and gold deposits are examples of resources which could help to make them economically successful. So that's a yes. So you have to be a little bit careful, but there were 3 easy ones at the beginning then before you got to the trickier ones. And so long as you keep the momentum going, you're going to pick up marks on the easy ones. And you can't afford to spend too much time debating over the slightly trickier ones at the end. You know, you think about it for a few seconds, and then you think, okay, I think that's right, and then you go for it, and you accept that just occasionally you'll get them wrong. You know, although I keep emphasizing that you've got to get really high scores in UCAT, we're not talking 100%. You know, you accept that you will get some wrong, you will probably run out of time a little bit, but it's just minimizing those is what you're aiming to do. Okay, so another one, same section, but this time the information you're given instead of being in text is a table. Sometimes when you get numerical things like that, you're going to need a calculator, but I don't think you do for this one, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so I think it depends very much on the individual, but some people find getting information from tables more difficult than getting it from text. So again, that's just an individual thing. But if you do, you know that's something you need to practice more. And there is a lot of scope for just you know, carelessly picking the wrong number because you don't read the column headings carefully or whatever. So you do have to be careful in these kind of questions. But anyway, let's go through and see what we think. So first of all, both soil sterilization and inoculation enhance plant growth. So the important thing is that you've got two columns which relate to growth. So one, growth after 1 year of transplantation, and one after 1.5 years. And you've got to look at both of those to make sure that this statement is true. So looking at the 1 year data, you can see that sterilization increases growth from 30 to 40, and then adding inoculation as well increases it from 40 to 52. So in that case, yes, they both increase growth, and you get the same pattern after 1.5 years. So that's a definite yes for that one. Then second one, maximum growth was recorded in the last 6 months of the experiment. So that's talking about the fact that you've got a measurement made after a year, and then you've got another measurement made after a year and a half. So the last 6 months is what changed in that second period between the 1 year data and the 1.5 year data. So looking at the growth, you can see in the first row, for example, that you got 30 centimeters after a year, but that increased by a whole 70 to reach 100 overall after the next 6 months. So there was much more growth in those last 6 months, and it's the same pattern in each of the rows. So again, that's a definite yes, that the fast growth happened in that second part of the experiment. Survival rate is highest when seedlings are grown in sterilized soil and are inoculated. So this way you've got to be careful, because now all the time so far we've been looking at growth, but now you've got to switch to the other columns and look at the survival rate. And you can see that this one is not true, because in that first survival column, you can see that sterilization but no inoculation gets 90% survival, and inoculation makes that drop to 80. So inoculation doesn't improve the survival rate. So that's a no. And then maximum growth was recorded, seedlings grown in sterilized soil but not inoculated. And yeah, that's a no, because you can see that if you inoculate as well as sterilization, you get quite a lot more growth, both after a year and after a year and a half. So that's a no. And finally, some seedlings that were grown in non-sterilized soil died after a year of transplantation. This is a really badly worded question. As I say, I didn't make these questions up, so I'm not holding my hands up to that one. I mean, generally, UCAT are quite good compared to, some things that you get off the internet and stuff, where half the questions are so badly worded that you've no idea what they're asking. Generally, they're quite good, but you do get some badly worded ones that sneak through. But this just means that if you look at the survival rates, does all the decrease from 100% happen during that first year, or does some of it happen in the second part of the experiment after the first year? And you can see, looking at the first row, that 28% had survived after a year, but that then decreased to 25%. So some of them died after that first year, and so that's a yes for that one. Okay, so not hugely difficult, but you have to have quite a lot of staying power to make sure you're working carefully through large amounts of data that you couldn't care less about. That's the trouble, I mean, it's not interesting generally, the stuff in these questions. You just have to grit your teeth and stay focused. That's the hard part. Okay, so we'll do one more of these, and this one I think is a little bit more challenging. And also, for this one, you might well need a calculator unless you have outstanding mental arithmetic. So for this afternoon, you can just use your phone or whatever calculator you have to hand. But in the real exam, you have to use an on-screen calculator, which I'll show to you when we do the quantitative reasoning in a couple of weeks' time, because that takes a bit of getting used to. But as I say, we'll worry about that later. Okay, so let's have a look through those. You can see that this was quite a lot, given that this also should have been doable in a minute. That's asking quite a lot. Some of these questions took calculating, which obviously slows you down, and some took a bit of thinking about. And that's just the way it is, that the level is quite variable, and their justification is, well, you should do the easy ones quickly so that you then have more time to spend on the more challenging ones. But also, it becomes clearer that some of these, not necessarily in this question, but sometimes they set ones which just would take ridiculously long to work out. And I think they're setting them to see if you can spot that you shouldn't do this, that you've got to prioritize and think, I haven't got time to do this here because I'm going to get bogged down. And I guess they think that's an important skill. When you're a clinician, you've got to prioritize the things that you can most effectively do with the time you've got available. So I suppose that's their sort of logic for that. Anyway, let's see what we think. So first one, 70% of the guests consumed carrot squares and nearly 89% of these fell ill. So that's just a calculation question. So you can see from the data that 35 people ate carrot squares, and it tells you in the information at the top that there were 50 guests. So 35 over 50 is 70%. So that part is right. And then 31 out of the 35 became ill. And if you calculate that, that's 89%. So that first one is correct. So it was straightforward. But more time consuming than you'd want it to be, because you've got, at least for the second one, you've probably got to calculate that on your calculator. So getting quick on the on-screen calculator is going to be important. Right, it's most likely that the sandwiches carried the bacteria that caused the outbreak. What did you have? You thought, yeah. What was your reasoning for that? Well, 36 ate the sandwiches and 32 fell ill. Whereas the onion soup was 20 out of 20. But actually, the trouble with looking at those data is that because almost everybody ate more than one thing, looking at the correlation between did you eat it and did you become ill is kind of a bit tricky. So actually what they wanted you to do was to look at the third and fourth columns and look at, say, if you didn't eat it, did that massively decrease your chances of becoming ill? And on that basis, sandwiches was the right answer. So you happily, and which is yeah. So based on that, you can see 14 people didn't eat sandwiches, and if the sandwiches are the things that carry the bacteria, those are the ones where you have a best chance of getting away with it. And you can see that's what the data point out. But that takes quite a lot of thinking through. So you just have to sometimes think, well, I think that sounds reasonable, but I'm not really sure. But hey, I'm going to go for that one and move on, because you can't spend 2 minutes deciding what's actually the best answer. You've got to do this in 20 seconds or whatever. So you just have to say, well, I think that's reasonable. So that was kind of a hard question to do at that sort of speed, I think. Okay, almost 91% of the people who attended the event suffered a gastroenteritis attack, I think. You can't tell because you've only got data for each individual food and how many people who ate that food became ill. But nowhere does it tell you how many people in total became ill. Because obviously, if you add up the numbers who ate onion soup and became ill and the numbers who ate sandwiches and became ill and so on, they come to far more than 50. So obviously, most people ate several of the foods, and therefore you just can't tell how many people managed to get away entirely. So that's a no. You can't deduce that. But you can see what they're trying to do is to lure you into doing some long, complicated calculation, which would actually have been pointless. And that's the game that you're got to try and not fall for. Okay, risk of developing gastroenteritis was highest for the people who ate carrot squares. Well, no, clearly not, because as we've already established, onion soup was the one that had the 100% illness rate. So, again, if you'd spent a long time on the more difficult previous question and therefore thought, oh, I'm spending too long on this question, I'll skip that one, that would have been a mistake, because that was a quick and easy one. And that's why you've got to be tough on yourself and say, I'm getting bogged down, I'm not going to think about this anymore, I'm going to guess and I'm going to move on. What they let you do is put a flag next to any question that you want to go back and check later. So if you've guessed one, then in the unlikely event that you still have time at the end, you can go back and have another look at them. And that's quite a good thing to do. Although in practice, you hardly ever have time left at the end anyway. But that's the thing to do, is force yourself to say, I'm taking too long on this, I'm going to guess and I'm going to move on. There is no negative marking. So it's crazy not to guess. Because it's just yes or no, so you have a 50% chance of getting it right. So leaving it blank is a really bad idea. Okay, among the guests who suffered gastroenteritis, curried rice was consumed more than other dishes. Well, no, because 32 people had consumed that, but then 32 had consumed sandwiches as well. So that's again a no. And that, I think, is it. So what we'll do is leave that there. So at the moment, we've covered half of the stuff in the decision section, and we'll cover the other half in a couple of weeks' time. Obviously, there's no lesson next week because of your exams, so it'll be a couple of weeks' time, and we'll look at more decision stuff then. The fact that it's taken a long time going through it is you shouldn't see that as a reflection that this is the section that's going to take the most preparation in the end, because once you've got the hang of the questions, you can just rattle through them just like you could any other kind. Okay, so we'll leave it there for today.